Joining me on the podcast is fellow alum of the Rutgers Political Science Graduate Program, Jessica Ronan, who is the program director of the Eagleton Institute Center for Youth Political Participation. Jessica is responsible for implementing the Are You Voting and Are You Ready programs, as well as working with a team of interns and students to develop materials for each program, facilitate the center's event series, and curate social media and website content. Jessica and I not only talked about voting rights, voter disenfranchisement, and youth participation as it relates to the local and national political landscape, but we also talk about how these rights are fundamental to accessing the American dream. I hope you enjoy. Jessica, thank you so much for being with me here on Here's a Podcast today.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, Kelly. I appreciate it.
So, well, one, I'm really excited because you are a fellow graduate of Rutgers Political Science Master's Program, United Nations and Global Policy. So it's so nice to be connected with a classmate again, and also someone who loves all things political science. So very excited for our conversation and to put our degrees to good use in the time that we have today.
I know, I could put this on my resume, use my political science master's.
So after the program, you went on to be a program coordinator for the Eagleton Institute's Center for Youth Political Participation. And not only do I enjoy talking to you as a former classmate, but you have a really interesting insight to what we're going to talk about today because you live and breathe voting rights and youth political participation. So here's the problem. Americans are not able to exercise their right to vote, which is a head scratcher because as Americans, we have the right to vote. It's the cornerstone of our democracy. It is a right that millions of people around the world do not have. And yet there are Americans who cannot vote. And Jack so eloquently and passionately talked about so many of these issues. And as someone who lives and breathes this every day, I'm really interested to get your perspective. And I think the first question would kind of be, what? What are the obstacles that are preventing people from exercising their right? Why are we even talking about this at all?
Yeah, so to be frank, and I could just get us started off with a little bit of background information, I did not have a large breadth of information about voting rights before I started in my current position. I was very fortunate growing up that I grew up in a small town in New Jersey, and my parents took me every single year to go and vote with them in every single election. If it was the school board we went, if it was, a primary or general election, I always knew that was something we did in June and November. And I never thought much about it. Like we just went in, my mom would say, okay, I'm going to vote for X, Y, and Z. And she'd press the button and we'd get our sticker and we'd leave. And I thought that was a very normal experience for a lot of Americans. I figured that every single American was going to be going with their parents, starting from a young age and going into the voting booth. And that's not the case. So I was very naive in that fact when I was graduating. It wasn't until I was in my current role that I have seen and observed the instances of unequal access to the polls in a way. So unequal access to voter registration, unequal access to getting to the polls on election day. And this is a large issue that we see in my role specifically with young people, but also going up to all various age groups. So why is this an issue? The issue of access is different states have different voting laws. Voting rights are not a universal right in a way. So it's not like, what we have in New Jersey is going to be very similar to what we have in Texas or what we have in California. Every single state makes their own voting laws. So if you're somebody who's living in New Jersey, your rights are different from somebody else, somebody in another state as well. So some ways that we see this issue of access to voting, and that's kind of the tool I want to really highlight here, is this is not an issue of the right itself, it's an issue of access. So in regards to this being an issue of access, we can see efforts to suppress the vote in young people, in people of color, based on gender, based on ethnicity as well. Through various ways. We can see that through access to vote by mail, access to early voting. And when I mean early voting, that can mean vote by mail, but also just having polling locations be open for longer periods of time on election rather than just being open on election day. It can be felons' rights as well, having that right to vote reestablished after you've paid your time and paid your dues. The most important, voter identification. So issues of voter identification of, needing to show an ID on election day that you're able to vote and that you're eligible as well. That's a major issue that we see affecting a lot of young people who may not have a driver's license, or for people who may not drive at all, even just adults.
So I grew up in New Jersey also. We went on election day, and when I was a kid, and then when I became of legal age to vote on my own, around the corner to the church where the polling places were on election day, you either took off or you went early in the morning because they open, I think, at like 6 before you go into work, or you rushed there after work. It sort of blew my mind as I got older and was paying more attention to national politics that they have early voting and polls open before election day. And I don't know why they don't do that in New Jersey. Perhaps you do. Are there pros or cons, or is there rationale for that? But it's sort of like, well, why don't we do that? And to your point, you just said every state has different election laws. So I guess my basic question would be like, why? Why isn't there one universal on a federal level election law for everybody to follow?
Well, in return to why we don't have that, so we have states' rights. States are able to share, these are the laws that we're going to have in our state. There can be federal oversight. So with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, that allowed for federal oversight to prevent issues, or supposed to prevent issues of voter suppression. But that doesn't, prevent, states from instituting laws that are, unequal or unjust. In regards to why we don't have early voting in a state like New Jersey, which is often, seen as a blue state, votes blue every political election, mostly. I think in regards to why we don't have it, I think it's really about capacity in a way. How much capacity does our state to implement these elections? I've spoken to a lot of people at the Board of Elections, and oftentimes they're just like, we're so overwhelmed and so busy. It's like, it's just another thing they have to do. And I also think that issue of capacity is, they only get a certain amount of time to count these votes. And, if they have, a smaller staff or a smaller team that could be implementing this, they're going to be like, oh, more people who are voting, that's more things we have to do and more time and more money. So I think that's kind of an issue of why we don't have early voting in our state. I wish we did. We do have non-absentee voting, no excuse absentee voting. So that's a kind of a way to do it, but I'd rather vote in person, honestly, on election, or in person in a polling location.
What is non-excuse absentee voting?
Non-excuse absentee voting is the ability to apply for a vote by mail ballot to come to your house without any excuse for it. So oftentimes in states, they might have vote by mail, but only people who are homebound, going to be away on election day, or have a specific circumstance. Maybe they're, they have a job or something where they have to be away, something like that. So in those cases, you can only do vote by mail if you have an excuse for it, and you could prove that you have an excuse. So for states that have non-excuse absentee voting, anybody can apply for vote by mail. So in those cases, a lot of times people who may be working on election day and they can't get to the polls from the 6 to 8 period, maybe they work overnight, maybe they work 12-hour shifts or 14-hour shifts, they can apply to have their ballot sent to their home, fill it out, and then send it in whenever they like. This is also a really big highlight for young people, for students who are especially away at college as well, that they're able to get their ballots sent to wherever they're going to be if they're not living in their home state on election day. So if you're living in Texas, you can have your ballot sent to Texas and you can still vote in a New Jersey election.
I have a million questions for you, and I'm trying to unpack them in logical order. Because maybe I'll start with the most basic one. Like, what is voter disenfranchisement? You talked about some of the obstacles, and one of them I heard was kind of passive. The idea that New Jersey just doesn't have the capacity to do early voting. And the more people that actually turn out and vote, the more of a burden it is on the system. So that seems structural and passive rather than deliberate. So when we talk about can we talk about disenfranchisement overall? And then I'd love to get into the nuances of what is passive. Just it's the structure, it's the capacity, it's mobilizing, and then the active forms of disenfranchisement, which, correct me if I'm wrong, if it's more of a deliberate attempt to prevent or deter people from voting, I would say for political issues.
Yeah. And I think, so when I talk about voter disenfranchisement, it is that it's either passive or it's an active process. I mostly think of it I think it's a double-edged sword. I think in more times, voter disenfranchisement is more so deliberate rather than not deliberate in a way. So when I talk about voter disenfranchisement, I think of it along the lines of preventing somebody from casting their ballot or putting limitations on how they can cast their ballot. So that's what I often think of when I think of voter disenfranchisement. Issues of passive forms of voter disenfranchisement is, like you said, that structural balance of, the Board of Elections doesn't have capacity. A big issue that we saw this year was, poll workers. So they didn't have enough people to work the polls. There was a very, very big, uptick of young people applying, because typically with the COVID-19 pandemic or before this, oftentimes these polling locations were run by older Americans, people over the age of 50. I know my polling location was in a retirement community and people were like 80 and up. So all of those poll workers were unable to go and do their usual work. So in those cases, polling locations could have been diminished because they didn't have the staff capacity to run them and host them. I think that is just, I think, a passive form. I wouldn't say that was a really active, deliberate way of doing it. I also think this is both passive and active, but just the lack of civics education that we have in this country. And, going to different school districts, you're not getting a standardized set of, you have to learn this by a certain amount of time. I know some districts, they have really strong AP government programs. They have other programs where, every student is registered. They have somebody come in, they do presentations. But then there's other districts who, they may be more disenfranchised, or, they just don't have the interest, or there's such a focus on STEM and other subjects and teaching the test that they don't get any civics education.
Where do we go to start addressing some of these? And that is a giant question that obviously looks different in 50 states, because, as you said, there are different voting laws, there are different types of voter disenfranchisement. So maybe if you have the macro view, please share. But I'll whittle it down to something a little more digestible. With what does Eagleton feel, and what is Eagleton doing to address these voter disenfranchisement issues so they're not as big of a challenge in the next election, in the election after that, and certainly when we get to the next presidential election in 4 years?
I can answer for, the first part of the macro question or the Eagleton question, because they're both the same answer.
Go for it.
So personally, I think that the way that we can handle these issues, or, start to break down or chip away at like this larger problem, is really just through access to education. I truthfully believe that if we have, every single child going to schools here in this country, they should be learning civic knowledge. It's something that can be involved in every single classroom setting, from kindergarten, for elementary school, middle school, high school level, and also in higher education as well. But, just broader access to education of civic knowledge. Maybe it's, through class trips to the Board of Elections, or, your state house, or things like that, bringing in elected officials. I think programs like this extracurricular opportunity as well, is going to be really, really valuable. The more information that you have, the more able you are to go and get yourself out there and go and vote. If you don't have access to that information, you don't have the key to go and do it. So I think just the broader education of it all, the broader nonpartisan education as well. And just really starting small in a lot of ways. So if you're somebody who wants to get started and, really encourage others to go out and vote, finding the information and also recognizing that as a reliable source. So maybe looking into your home state's Department of State, where, or your Division of Elections or something like that, getting started there. Reaching out to those departments as well. These people want to help you. And oftentimes, I know it often seems like they don't, but really they're there to help you. So really reaching out to reliable sources so you can get your questions answered. And also looking at some nonpartisan organizations as well, such as vote411.org. They're through the League of Women Voters of the US. Ballotpedia as well, for finding out who's on your ballot and what they represent to you. And just really sticking to nonpartisan, reliable resources and getting that broader access to education. I think that's right now the easiest way, in a way, to what's called make some of these, really adjust some of these challenges.
I'd like to thank Jessica for joining me today, and I'd also like to thank all those who made this podcast possible. Our wonderful production team, the George Milton Group, Winnie and the Moog for our theme song, Success of the Whole Team, and my Teen Think Tank Project co-founder, Matthew DeSantis. Most importantly, I'd like to thank you, the listener. Let us know that you're listening, subscribe, rate, and review this podcast, and follow the podcast at @problem_pod. For more information on today's topic or how you can find out more about social justice programming for exceptional teens, please follow the Teen Think Tank Project at @teen_think tank. Until next week, I'm Kelly Nagle.